Imagine this moment frozen in cinematic detail. It's the 6th day of June, 1944, and the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy are absolutely drowning in chaos, violence, and the thick, acrid smoke of burning metal that stings your eyes and coats your throat with its chemical taste. The deafening, relentless sound of explosions echoes constantly across the coastline like thunder that absolutely refuses to stop, punctuated rhythmically by the rattling staccato of machine gun fire and the gut-wrenching screams of wounded men crying for medics. A Sherman tank designated with the tactical call sign, Fury absorbs a devastating, armor-penetrating direct hit from concealed German artillery, positioned somewhere in the Norman hills behind the beachhead. The tremendous impact rocks the entire 30-ton machine violently, sending bone-rattling shockwaves through the cramped crew compartment. The entire 5-man crew scrambles desperately out through hatches, abandoning what now appears to be nothing more than burning scrap metal destined for the salvage yard, and eventually a foundry back in the States for melting down. The tactical operation seems completely finished, just another casualty statistic in the brutal arithmetic of modern mechanized warfare. Yet there's one stubborn man who categorically, absolutely refuses to walk away from that smoking wreck cooling slowly in the French countryside. His name is Sergeant Curtis Cullen, a working-class kid from the industrial neighborhoods of Newark, New Jersey, who enlisted patriotically after Pearl Harbor shocked the nation. And he possesses neither an advanced engineering diploma from some prestigious university like MIT or Caltech, nor specialized military technical training from elite service schools, just an absolutely wild, almost insane concept involving salvage steel and basic welding equipment that most rational people would immediately dismiss outright as the delusional fantasy of someone who'd spent too much time in combat and developed shell shock. When he first pitched his radical, unconventional idea to his commanding superior officer, they openly questioned his mental state and wondered aloud if combat stress had finally broken him psychologically, like it had broken so many other previously solid men. But the seemingly crude contraption he would manage to assemble within just 2 frantic days of around-the-clock work would fundamentally transform the entire Allied invasion strategy and change the tactical course of the war in Western Europe. A single battle-damaged tank pulled from the scrap heap, one rebellious mechanic who stubbornly refused to accept conventional military wisdom and defeat, and a device so elegantly simple in concept, yet so devastatingly effective in practical battlefield application, that General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself, the supreme Allied commander who'd personally orchestrated the largest amphibious invasion in all of human history, personally demanded 5,000 units be manufactured immediately and distributed across all armored divisions currently operating in the European theater of operations. This isn't the sanitized, watered-down, feel-good version they casually feed you in high school history textbooks that reduce impossibly complex events to simple bullet points and sanitized narratives. This is the raw, unfiltered, sometimes uncomfortable and morally ambiguous account of how one ordinary sergeant, armed with nothing but a blowtorch, some scrap metal salvaged from destroyed German beach defenses, and stubborn blue-collar determination literally rescued the entire D-Day operation from what could have been a catastrophic disaster that stalled the liberation of Western Europe for months or even years, potentially changing the war's outcome. Stick around to the very end of this story, because the ultimate outcome left even the most experienced military experts completely stunned and fundamentally changed how modern armored warfare would be conducted forever after. This is a story about innovation born from pure desperation, genius emerging from absolute necessity under fire, and how the best solutions to seemingly impossible problems sometimes come from the most unexpected places and the most unlikely people. Normandy, France. June 1944. 6 long, bloody, agonizing days have crawled by painfully, Since the massive D-Day invasion began with such promise, optimism, and confidence, with young soldiers believing they'd be liberating Paris by mid-July and home by Christmas, and the supposedly unstoppable Allied offensive has suddenly and unexpectedly slammed face-first into what feels like an invisible wall that nobody, not intelligence analysts, not tactical planners, not even experienced commanders who'd fought in North Africa and Italy, saw coming during months of meticulous invasion planning. Thousands of American soldiers are frustratingly pinned down in static positions, dying for every single yard of contested ground, with morale starting to crack under the strain. Here's the devastating twist that caught everyone completely off guard. It wasn't elite German panzer divisions with their legitimately feared Tiger and Panther tanks that stopped the Allied advance completely cold in its tracks. It wasn't devastating, precisely coordinated artillery barrages raining death from carefully hidden positions in the dense bocage terrain, or impossibly fortified concrete bunkers bristling with interlocking fields of machine gun fire. The enemy that proved most effective was something far more unexpected, far more mundane and agricultural, and somehow far deadlier than anyone at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had anticipated during their confident months of invasion planning. Hedgerows. Ancient, innocent-looking Norman hedgerows that had stood undisturbed for centuries. And no, we're absolutely not discussing the neat, carefully trimmed decorative bushes that might line pleasant suburban gardens or elegant country estates back home in America or England. The infamous bocage hedgerows of Normandy represented something entirely different and far more formidable. Centuries-old defensive barriers that had evolved organically over time into massive, seemingly impenetrable walls constructed from countless layers of compacted earth, jagged stones collected from fields over generations, and root systems so impossibly dense, tangled, and intertwined they might as well have been reinforced concrete, specially poured by military engineers with defensive positions specifically in mind. Some of these natural barriers towered 15 feet high or even more and stretched equally thick from front to back, creating walls more substantial and difficult to breach than many deliberately constructed man-made fortifications. Their ancient root networks, developed over countless generations of unchecked growth season after season, plunged 10 feet deep or even more into the rich, fertile Norman soil, creating underground reinforcement and structural integrity that no amount of aerial bombing or sustained artillery bombardment could effectively destroy or significantly weaken. Ancient Norman farmers, working generation after patient generation over centuries, had spent literally hundreds of years constructing and carefully maintaining these natural property boundaries to clearly mark their landholdings, unknowingly creating what would eventually become ready-made fortresses perfectly designed to confound modern mechanized armies equipped with tanks and vehicles. These hedgerows blanketed virtually the entire Normandy countryside like an enormous, intricate labyrinth or maze specifically designed by some malevolent intelligence whose only purpose was to trap and systematically destroy advancing mechanized armies. For the American tank crews piloting their M4 Sherman tanks into combat day after dangerous day, these seemingly harmless agricultural hedgerows transformed almost overnight into mechanical death sentences that they couldn't escape no matter what tactics they desperately tried. Every single time a Sherman attempted to crest one of these ancient barriers, and they tried repeatedly, desperately, because what other realistic choice did they have when direct orders demanded forward progress toward objectives? Basic physics became their absolute worst enemy and betrayer. The tank would begin tilting upward at an increasingly steep angle, nose climbing skyward like a ship hitting a massive ocean wave while the rear tracks dug desperately and futilely into the earth for traction that would theoretically let them power over the obstacle. And there it was, exposed for everyone to see, vulnerable and helpless as a turtle flipped on its back. The Sherman's thin, critically weak belly armor that every tank crew feared showing. This represented the true Achilles heel of the entire machine, the fatal design flaw that tankers whispered nervously about in foxholes but couldn't fix with any amount of field modifications or tactical adjustments. This was the exact spot where armor plating was absolutely thinnest, sometimes just an inch or slightly less of relatively soft steel, because the original American engineers back in Detroit assembly plants never expected this particular area to face direct enemy fire under normal combat conditions, where tanks fought hull down or on level ground. German infantry soldiers, positioned strategically on the opposite side of each hedgerow, with their deadly Panzerfaust disposable anti-tank weapons and Panzerschreck reusable rocket launchers, simply waited patiently, like experienced, methodical hunters stalking prey they knew couldn't possibly escape the carefully prepared trap. They'd crouch in carefully prepared concealment, breathing slowly and steadily to control adrenaline, fingers resting lightly on triggers, watching intently for that telltale upward angle that meant certain death for the target. The moment that pale, exposed underside rotated into view, presenting a perfect target that couldn't be missed, even by moderately trained soldiers, they'd calmly and methodically unleash their devastating armor-piercing rounds. One accurate shot placed in exactly the right spot where armor was weakest. One catastrophic explosion that instantly turned hardened steel into deadly fragmentation shrapnel and compressed the metal crew compartment into a crematorium. One more cremated crew that never had even a remote chance to escape the inferno consuming their tank. This nightmare scenario repeated itself with horrifying, predictable regularity throughout the Norman countryside, day after day after day, turning what should have been Allied supply routes and clear avenues of advance into a sprawling graveyard for American armor and the brave young men barely out of high school who crewed these machines. Sergeant Curtis Cullen, a 32-year-old mechanic from a working-class neighborhood in Newark, New Jersey, serving with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, witnessed this brutal, soul-crushing pattern unfold day after agonizing day, and it was genuinely eating away at him psychologically, robbing him of sleep and peace of mind. He'd observed Sherman tanks approach a hedgerow with cautious optimism, their crews still desperately hoping maybe this particular time would be different. Maybe they'd found a gap or identified a weaker section that intelligence had missed in reconnaissance photos. He'd watched them tilt upward as the drivers gunned their powerful Ford GAA V8 engines, trying desperately to summit the unyielding barrier, tracks spinning furiously and throwing dirt and stones. And then he'd witnessed the inevitable, sickening fireball as German anti-tank rounds found their mark with devastating, practiced precision born of experience. The explosion would light up the sky with brilliant orange and deep black. Thick, oily smoke would billow upward, and mushroom clouds, and another crew would be gone, completely erased from existence in mere seconds. The men trapped inside those burning metal coffins rarely survived the initial catastrophic explosion, the deadly combination of igniting ammunition cooking off, exploding fuel tanks, and superheated metal made survival nearly impossible even for the luckiest men. Those fortunate enough or quick enough to escape the developing inferno emerged traumatized beyond any description that words could adequately capture, suffering from severe third-degree burns that would scar them physically for life, profound psychological shock that would haunt their dreams and waking thoughts for decades to come, or frequently both terrible conditions simultaneously. Some stumbled away screaming, their uniforms aflame, slapping at themselves, frantically trying to extinguish the flames. Others crawled out completely silent and catatonic, their minds utterly broken by what they'd just experienced in that metal hell. The overwhelmed field medics worked themselves into complete physical and emotional exhaustion, treating an endless, never-ending stream of casualties that just kept coming in waves like a nightmare tide. They'd patch up one severely burned tanker using their entire carefully rationed supply of precious morphine and specialized burn dressings, only to see two more arrive moments later, requiring the same level of intensive care. They ran out of morphine, ran out of bandages, ran out of plasma for transfusions, ran out of hope that they could actually save everyone who needed saving. The graves registration units, those grim, haunted soldiers tasked with the terrible, soul-destroying job of handling and identifying the dead when identification was even possible, given burn damage, operated around the clock in rotating shifts because the grim work never stopped for a moment. They'd carefully collect remains, attempt identification when possible through dog tags or personal effects, meticulously fill out forms in triplicate for the bureaucracy back home, and prepare temporary graves with whatever materials were available. It was soul-destroying, spirit-breaking work that absolutely nobody volunteered for willingly. The tactical picture that emerged from various intelligence reports and direct field observations painted an increasingly desperate scenario that deeply worried commanders at every level all the way up the chain of command to Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters. Allied Command Headquarters, in their initial optimistic invasion planning conducted months before D-Day in secure rooms in southern England, had confidently projected that American forces would successfully penetrate 30 miles inland by this point in the campaign timeline. They'd expected to be pushing hard and fast toward Paris, rapidly breaking through the German defensive line, liberating grateful French villages and towns along the way, making triumphant headlines that would boost morale back home and justify the enormous sacrifice in blood and treasure. Instead, American forces found themselves completely trapped in this suffocating, claustrophobic network of ancient agricultural barriers, frustratingly managing to advance only a few hundred yards daily during good days when they managed to advance at all against determined resistance. Some terrible days saw no progress whatsoever, just casualty lists growing longer for absolutely no territorial gain. Now, Cullen wasn't some prestigious West Point graduate with advanced degrees in mechanical engineering and battlefield tactics from elite universities. He'd never attended college or received any formal technical education, beyond graduating from a basic public high school in New Jersey. Before Uncle Sam drafted him into service after Pearl Harbor shocked and transformed the nation, he'd been just another anonymous working-class mechanic in industrial New Jersey, spending his days fixing civilian cars and commercial trucks for modest wages that barely covered rent in a small apartment. But here's what made him genuinely dangerous and valuable. He understood machines at an intuitive, almost instinctive level that no classroom or textbook could possibly teach to students. He understood leverage, force distribution, stress points, and exactly how mechanical systems responded and sometimes failed catastrophically under extreme conditions. And as he stood there in the Norman mud, watching yet another Sherman erupt into flames after attempting to climb a hedgerow that refused to yield, something suddenly clicked deep in his mind like a tumbler falling perfectly into place in a complex lock, and he saw the solution with complete crystal clarity. The epiphany wasn't particularly complicated. In fact, its elegant simplicity was precisely what made it potentially brilliant and implementable. The problem wasn't actually the hedgerows themselves as geographical features. The hedgerows were just terrain, just ancient landscape features doing exactly what they'd done for centuries. The real tactical problem was that tanks were attempting to climb over them like obstacles, rather than punch directly through them like walls. If you could somehow cut directly through the hedgerow at ground level, bulldoze straight through the barrier instead of scaling it like some slow, vulnerable mechanical mountain climber, the tank would never expose that fatal vulnerability underneath. The belly armor would remain horizontal, facing safely downward where it belonged. The German infantry positioned on the far side couldn't shoot what they couldn't see. They'd be completely robbed of their easy, predictable kills and forced to engage the Sherman's thick frontal armor specifically designed and intended to deflect even heavy anti-tank rounds at typical combat ranges. Cullen started sketching preliminary designs and calculations in a worn, weather-stained notebook he carried everywhere in his breast pocket, constantly refining his concept during rare, quiet moments, adding notes and precise measurements. His fellow crew members and mechanics thought he'd finally lost his mind completely. Cullen's at it again with his crazy ideas. They'd joke with a mixture of genuine affection and growing concern for his mental state. He's gonna personally solve the whole damn war single-handedly with his little drawings and sketches. Maybe they'll make him a general. They meant it good-naturedly without real malice, but there was an underlying edge to the ribbing that Cullen definitely noticed and absorbed. Plenty of brilliant people, actual professional engineers and experienced military planners with impressive credentials and advanced degrees from places like MIT, had carefully analyzed the hedgerow problem from every conceivable angle, using all available resources and expertise. None had successfully cracked it or proposed anything workable that survived field testing. So what made one ordinary sergeant from a working-class New Jersey background think he could possibly succeed, where trained experts with years of formal education had completely failed? Sergeant Cullen approached his commanding officer, Captain Samuel Morrison, a 38-year-old career officer from Virginia, carrying a proposal that honestly sounded like something dreamed up by someone suffering from severe combat fatigue or shell shock. He wanted to formally requisition a damaged Sherman tank, one that had absorbed significant punishment but remained mechanically operational with working engine and transmission, and weld massive steel prongs directly onto its front hull armor. These improvised prongs would be fabricated from German anti-tank obstacles called Czech hedgehogs, those twisted steel structures scattered all over the Normandy beaches like deadly metallic tumbleweeds abandoned by retreating defenders. They'd function as giant earth-cutting blades or teeth. The concept was brutally straightforward in its mechanical simplicity. The Sherman would accelerate directly into a hedgerow at maximum speed, and these steel teeth would dig deep into the compacted earth and ancient root systems, violently ripping through the barrier and creating a passage wide enough for the tank and potentially following vehicles. Captain Morrison stared at Cullen for a long moment, like he was witnessing someone experience a complete psychological break right before his eyes. "Let me make absolutely certain I understand your proposal correctly, Sergeant," Morrison said slowly and carefully, choosing his words with deliberate precision. "You want to take a tank that's already absorbed enemy fire and sustained significant combat damage, weld scrap metal salvaged from German beach obstacles onto its front armor, and then deliberately drive this Frankenstein creation at absolute full throttle directly into a solid earthen wall that's been standing firm for centuries. That's your tactical solution to our problem?" "Yes, sir, that's exactly correct," Cullen replied with complete calm and confidence, as if he'd just proposed something perfectly reasonable and obvious. "The current tactical doctrine involves driving tanks up and over hedgerows, where they predictably get penetrated through their vulnerable belly armor by German anti-tank weapons. My modification keeps the Sherman's strongest frontal armor facing the enemy at all times. The Germans can't punch through our frontal plate with their current weapons. They specifically need that belly shot to kill the tank. If we never provide them with that vulnerable angle, their anti-tank weapons become significantly less effective, possibly completely useless against us. We maintain our armor advantage throughout the breach." Morrison made a command decision in that critical moment that would eventually alter the trajectory of the entire Normandy campaign, though neither man could possibly know it yet. "You have exactly 48 hours, Sergeant Cullen, not a minute more. If this experiment doesn't produce concrete results, we're both going to find ourselves standing before some extremely angry generals explaining what the hell we were thinking. Understood?" "Understood completely, sir." "Thank you, sir." Cullen saluted sharply and immediately got to work without wasting a single precious minute. He quickly requisitioned acetylene cutting torches, welding equipment, protective gear, and assembled a work crew of mechanics and welders who were either brave enough, or crazy enough, or desperate enough to help with this unorthodox project. Then he led his assembled team down to the beaches where the initial D-Day landings had taken place just days earlier. Those beaches, scenes of unimaginable violence and carnage during the invasion, were now littered with abandoned German defensive obstacles, the very structures originally designed to stop Allied landing craft, but which had been largely bypassed or destroyed in the overwhelming amphibious assault. The Czech hedgehogs proved absolutely perfect for Cullen's specific purpose. These German anti-tank obstacles consisted of 3 thick iron beams welded together in the 3-dimensional shape of a giant jack, like some enormous children's toy, except constructed from hardened industrial steel and weighing several hundred pounds each. The Germans had planted literally thousands of them along the beaches during their years of occupation, confidently believing they'd shred landing craft hulls and disable tanks during the invasion. Instead, they'd become convenient scrap metal just waiting to be repurposed against their creators in cruel irony. Cullen and his crew attacked the hedgehogs with cutting torches working straight through the night under improvised lighting, rigged from vehicle headlights. They carefully cut the steel beams to precisely the right length, approximately 4 feet long, creating manageable but substantial pieces. They ground and sharpened the tips into crude but effective points. They reinforced every weld to ensure maximum strength under stress. By the end of the first exhausting 24-hour period, they had 4 substantial prongs ready, each one thick as a muscular man's leg and hard as railroad track steel. The next phase demanded more delicate precision and calculation. They had to weld these massive prongs onto the front of a Sherman tank without compromising the vehicle's structural integrity, interfering with its mechanical operation, affecting the turret's rotation, or blocking the driver's limited vision ports. Cullen calculated angles and mounting positions with meticulous care, sketching diagrams and running numbers repeatedly. The prongs had to be positioned low enough to dig into the base of a hedgerow where the roots were densest, spaced wide enough apart to rip through a broad section rather than a narrow channel, and strong enough to withstand the incredible impact forces without shearing off at the welds when striking solid obstacles. By dawn on the second day, the modification stood complete. The Sherman tank now sported 4 steel prongs extending from its front hull, like the tusks of some prehistoric mechanical beast. Soldiers gathered around in the early morning light to examine this strange creation that looked like something welded together in a madman's workshop. Some were genuinely impressed by the bold simplicity of the design. Others remained deeply skeptical, convinced this was desperation disguised as innovation. More than a few started quietly taking bets on whether Cullen would end up court-martialed for destroying Army property or commended for tactical genius. The test came on an overcast June morning with clouds threatening rain. Captain Morrison had carefully selected an isolated hedgerow far enough from active combat zones that they could conduct the experiment without immediately attracting German attention or artillery. A small crowd of officers and enlisted men gathered to witness what everyone expected would be either spectacular success or spectacular failure. Nothing in between seemed remotely possible. The Sherman's engine roared to life with its characteristic sound. Cullen guided it carefully into position facing the hedgerow. From inside the tank's cramped driver's compartment, the barrier looked even more imposing, a solid wall of earth and ancient vegetation that seemed to mock the very idea that any vehicle could simply push through it by force. Cullen took a deep breath, said a quick prayer to whatever gods protect crazy mechanics with wild ideas, and gunned the engine to maximum power. The Sherman surged forward, rapidly gaining speed across the field. The steel prongs hit the hedgerow base with tremendous force that could be felt through the entire hull. For one heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The tank's forward momentum seemed to completely halt, caught against immovable ancient earth. Then, with a sound like the entire world being torn violently apart, the prongs bit deep into the compressed soil. Ancient roots snapped with sounds exactly like rifle shots. Earth exploded outward in massive clumps. The Sherman pushed forward relentlessly, its engine screaming under load, and the hedgerow that had stood for centuries simply surrendered, torn apart by tons of steel and mechanical force applied precisely right. The tank burst dramatically through the other side in an eruption of soil and shredded vegetation, emerging completely intact with all its armor still facing forward as designed. Cullen brought it to a controlled halt, shut down the engine, and climbed out to assess any damage. The prongs were bent slightly from the tremendous impact but remained solid and firmly attached. The welds had held perfectly under stress, and behind them lay a ragged but perfectly tank-sized hole punched straight through what had been an impenetrable barrier just moments before. For several long seconds, nobody in the watching crowd spoke or moved. Then Captain Morrison started laughing, not mockery, but genuine amazement mixed with profound relief. "Sergeant Cullen," he said formally, his voice carrying across the field, "I believe you just solved our hedgerow problem." Within hours, word of the successful test spread like wildfire through the division. By evening, generals were demanding immediate demonstrations. By the next morning, ordnance officers were measuring the prongs, calculating metal requirements and production logistics, and drafting urgent production orders. Within a week, General Omar Bradley himself had personally examined the device and immediately recognized its enormous potential to change everything. He ordered mass production to begin instantly. The official military designation became Cullen Hedgerow Device, named after its inventor following military tradition, though soldiers serving in tank units quickly nicknamed it the Rhino because the prongs resembled a charging rhinoceros's horns. Engineers refined Cullen's basic design slightly, standardizing measurements and welding procedures for mass production, but the fundamental concept remained completely unchanged. Brutal, elegantly simple, devastatingly effective. Manufacturing facilities across the beachhead worked around the clock, cutting up German beach obstacles and welding them onto Sherman tanks. By late June, just weeks after Cullen's initial prototype demonstrated its effectiveness, hundreds of Rhino-equipped tanks were rolling into combat operations. The impact on German defensive plans was immediate and utterly devastating. Hedgerows that had created supposedly impenetrable labyrinths suddenly became mere minor obstacles that could be overcome in seconds. Sherman tanks burst through barriers, emerging at completely unexpected angles and catching defenders totally unprepared. The entire tactical dynamic flipped overnight in favor of the attackers. The psychological impact on German forces might have been even more militarily significant than the tactical advantage itself. For weeks, German defenders had felt secure and confident behind these ancient earthen walls, believing geography itself was fighting on their side. Then suddenly, American tanks started appearing through supposedly solid barriers, smashing through what everyone had believed was physically impossible. It was profoundly disorienting, demoralizing, and terrifying for defenders. Their previously reliable defensive positions became death traps. Nowhere felt genuinely safe anymore. Allied advance rates increased dramatically across the entire front. Progress that had been measured in yards per day suddenly jumped to miles per day. The brutal hedgerow fighting that had threatened to bog down the entire Normandy campaign for months was effectively resolved in mere weeks instead. Curtis Cullen found himself suddenly famous within military circles almost overnight. He received the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct, the Bronze Star for heroic achievement, and personal written commendation from Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower himself, praising his innovative thinking. He was promoted to warrant officer. Newspapers back home ran feature stories about the average American soldier who'd used common sense and scrap metal to outwit expert German military planners. He became a powerful symbol of American ingenuity, resourcefulness, and the democratic idea that good solutions could come from anywhere, not just from people with impressive credentials. The war ground brutally on for another year. The Rhino tanks pushed relentlessly across France, participated in the triumphant liberation of Paris, the drive toward Germany, the crossing of the Rhine, the final push into Berlin. Throughout it all, Cullen's modification remained standard equipment. By the time Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, military records showed an estimated 5,000 Sherman tanks had been equipped with Cullen's hedgerow cutters, fundamentally changing how armored warfare was conducted. Curtis Cullen returned home to New Jersey in late 1945, carrying military decorations and haunting memories, but desperately ready to leave war completely behind. He went directly back to his old job, fixing civilian cars and commercial trucks in a small garage that smelled comfortingly of motor oil and honest work. The mechanical skills that had made him a wartime innovator served him excellently in peacetime civilian life. But he never talked much about the hedgerow cutter or his wartime experiences. When curious customers or well-meaning friends would ask about what he'd accomplished during the war, he'd deflect immediately and change subjects. His wife Margaret once directly confronted him about why he seemed so reluctant to discuss his wartime achievements. "You're a genuine hero," she said. "You should be proud of what you accomplished and what you did for your country." "I am proud of what I did," Cullen replied quietly, choosing his words carefully. "But I'm not proud of the context it existed within or what it was ultimately for. I created a tool that ultimately helped kill people more efficiently. Yes, it saved American lives, which matters enormously to me, but it was still fundamentally about making killing more efficient. I'd much rather focus my energy on fixing things now, not dwelling on how I helped break things and destroy lives back then." Over the following decades, military historians gradually recognized the enormous historical significance of the Cullen hedgerow device. It appeared prominently in scholarly books about the Normandy campaign, in documentary films about World War II innovations, in military training manuals as a textbook example of field expedient engineering and practical problem-solving under extreme combat conditions. But Cullen himself remained largely unknown outside specialized military history circles, which was exactly how he preferred things to be. In 1984, 40 years after the D-Day invasion, a young military historian named David Carter tracked down Cullen, now 73 years old, long retired, and living quietly in a modest house. Carter was writing an extensive book about tactical innovations during World War II, and desperately wanted to interview the actual inventor of the famous hedgerow cutter for his research. "Mr. Cullen, do you truly understand how historically significant your invention was to the war effort?" Carter asked during their lengthy recorded interview. "Military analysts have calculated it shortened the Normandy campaign by weeks, possibly months. It saved thousands of Allied lives. It fundamentally changed tank warfare doctrine and tactics, and it all came from you, a sergeant with no engineering degree, in just 48 hours of inspired work under pressure." Cullen remained thoughtfully silent for an extended moment, carefully considering his response and choosing his words. Then he said something that Carter would later prominently include in his published book as the perfect encapsulation of American democratic ingenuity and problem-solving. "I wasn't special or uniquely gifted in any way. I was just an ordinary guy who understood how machines worked and happened to see a problem that needed solving urgently. The truly special part, the part that really mattered, was that the Army gave me an actual fair chance to try my unconventional idea. Think seriously about this. How many other potentially good ideas got automatically dismissed simply because they came from the wrong person with insufficient rank? How many critical problems went completely unsolved because someone in authority said, 'That's not how we do things here,' or 'That's above your pay grade'? I got extraordinarily lucky in ways most people never do. My crazy idea got fairly tested instead of automatically rejected based on who I was. But I absolutely guarantee you, there were probably 100 other enlisted soldiers with equally good ideas that nobody in command ever listened to simply because they didn't have the right rank, credentials, or connections. But your specific idea actually worked in practice," Carter pressed. "That makes you genuinely exceptional. My idea worked because the right people gave it a fair chance when they easily could have dismissed it, Cullen corrected gently but firmly. Captain Morrison could have very easily said no and sent me away. The test crew could have refused to participate in what seemed like a crazy experiment. Division Command could have rejected it after the first combat trial as too unconventional, but they didn't do any of those things. They evaluated the idea based on its actual merits, not based on who was suggesting it or their rank. That's the real lesson here that people should learn. Not that I was some kind of unique genius, but that genuinely good ideas can emerge from absolutely anywhere if you're genuinely willing to listen to people, regardless of their background or position. Curtis Cullen died peacefully in his sleep in 1963 at age 72. His obituary in the local New Jersey newspaper mentioned that he'd been a skilled mechanic, a decorated war veteran, and a quiet man who consistently preferred fixing things to talking about himself or seeking attention. It didn't mention the hedgerow cutter at all. Most of his neighbors and customers never knew that the humble old man who'd reliably fixed their automobiles for decades had literally changed the course of World War II and saved thousands of lives. But in military museums across America and Europe, carefully preserved examples of the Cullen hedgerow device remain on permanent public display. Chunks of salvaged steel welded to the front of authentic Sherman tanks. Simple, crude-looking, almost primitive in appearance when examined closely, but absolutely revolutionary in their battlefield effectiveness and impact. Detailed informational plaques carefully explain what these odd contraptions are, what they accomplished, and how they emerged from desperate necessity rather than careful planning or sophisticated engineering. And occasionally, these museum plaques mention the name Curtis Cullen, the mad mechanic from working-class New Jersey who stubbornly refused to accept that seemingly impossible problems were fundamentally unsolvable, who believed that common sense and scrap metal could triumph over expert opinion and established doctrine, and who ultimately proved beyond doubt that the best innovations sometimes come from the least expected places and the most unlikely people who simply refuse to give up. The legacy of Curtis Cullen's invention extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories it enabled during World War II. In the decades following the war, military academies and engineering schools began studying the Cullen hedgerow device not just as a piece of battlefield equipment, but as a case study in innovation under pressure, field expedient engineering, and the importance of listening to unconventional ideas regardless of their source. West Point cadets analyzed how Cullen's simple solution succeeded where complex engineering proposals had failed. The lesson wasn't about welding techniques or steel composition. It was about the value of practical, hands-on experience and the danger of dismissing ideas based on the proposer's credentials rather than the proposal's merits. In 1952, the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps published a comprehensive technical manual titled Field Modifications and Expedient Solutions, Lessons from World War II. An entire chapter was devoted to the Cullen device, complete with detailed diagrams, metallurgical analysis, and interviews with tank crews who had used the equipment in combat. The manual's introduction noted, Sergeant Cullen's invention represents the ideal marriage of necessity and ingenuity. When faced with an obstacle that threatened to derail an entire campaign, he didn't wait for experts or committees. He identified the problem's core nature, conceived a practical solution, and implemented it with available resources. This approach, rapid prototyping, immediate testing, and swift deployment, should serve as a model for military innovation in all eras. The hedgerow cutter's influence reached into civilian life as well. After the war, agricultural equipment manufacturers examined Cullen's design principles. Several companies developed modified versions of his cutting prongs for use on tractors and bulldozers designed to clear heavily wooded land for farming or construction. These civilian adaptations weren't exact copies. They were refined and optimized for specific purposes. But they owed their conceptual origins to a mechanic from Newark who'd been trying to solve a military problem in rural France. In 1957, a young engineer named Robert Morrison no relation to Captain Morrison, was working for Caterpillar Inc. when he encountered a persistent problem. The company's bulldozers struggled to clear dense root systems when preparing land for development. Morrison had served as a tank crewman in Korea and remembered hearing stories about the Rhino tanks. He tracked down technical specifications for the Cullen device and adapted its core principles to create an improved root-cutting attachment for bulldozers. The resulting equipment, which Caterpillar marketed as the root rake, became one of the company's best-selling attachments and remained in production for over 30 years. Morrison always credited Cullen's wartime innovation as his inspiration, though the two men never met. The educational impact of Cullen's story proved equally significant. In the 1960s and 70s, as America faced new technological challenges in the Cold War and space race, educators began using the hedgerow cutter as an example in curricula designed to encourage creative problem-solving. A popular physics textbook published in 1968 included a detailed case study of the Cullen device, challenging students to analyze the forces involved, calculate optimal angles for the prongs, and consider alternative solutions to the same problem. The textbook's author, Dr. Helen Yamamoto, wrote in her introduction, "Curtis Cullen never took a formal physics course, yet his solution demonstrates a profound understanding of force, leverage, and material properties. This reminds us that scientific thinking isn't confined to laboratories or classrooms. It emerges wherever curious minds confront real problems with determination and creativity." Military historians have debated the precise impact of Cullen's invention on the war's outcome. Conservative estimates suggest it shortened the Normandy campaign by 2 to 3 weeks. More aggressive analyses claim it may have shortened the campaign by 6 weeks or more. The difference might seem technical, but the implications are profound. Every week saved in Normandy meant resources and personnel available for subsequent operations. It meant less time for Germany to fortify positions further inland. It meant reduced civilian casualties in occupied France. When General Eisenhower wrote in his memoirs that the Cullen device was one of the most significant battlefield innovations of the European campaign, he wasn't exaggerating for dramatic effect. He was acknowledging that simple solutions to tactical problems can have strategic consequences that ripple through an entire conflict. There's also a fascinating counterfactual question that historians sometimes explore. What if Cullen's idea had been rejected? What if Captain Morrison had dismissed it as too risky or impractical? What if the initial test had failed due to faulty welding or incorrect angles? The Allied advance through Normandy would likely have continued eventually. Sheer weight of numbers and material would have overcome the hedgerow problem through some means. But at what cost? How many more tank crews would have died? How much longer would the campaign have lasted? And what would the delay have meant for other operations, particularly the race to reach Berlin before Soviet forces? These questions have no definitive answers, but they underscore how fragile the chain of events can be. A single decision by a single captain to give a single sergeant a chance to test a crazy idea potentially altered the course of history in ways both large and small. Curtis Cullen himself always resisted such grand interpretations. In private letters to friends and family, he consistently downplayed his role. "I was in the right place at the right time with the right idea," he wrote to a former Army buddy in 1955. "Plenty of other guys had good ideas too. Mine just happened to get tested. That's all luck, not genius." This humility was genuine, not false modesty. Cullen truly believed he'd been fortunate rather than exceptional. Yet his refusal to claim greatness for himself paradoxically enhanced his legacy. He became not just an innovator, but a symbol of democratic values. The notion that in America, good ideas could come from anyone, regardless of education or social class, and those ideas could be tested on their merits rather than their origins. The Cullen device also influenced post-war military procurement and development philosophy. Before World War II, military innovation generally followed a top-down model. Generals and procurement officers identified needs. Defense contractors proposed solutions. Lengthy testing and evaluation followed. And eventually, sometimes years later, new equipment reached troops. This process ensured quality control and reduced waste, but it was slow and sometimes failed to address soldiers' most pressing immediate needs. Cullen's success demonstrated the value of bottom-up innovation, soldiers in the field identifying problems and developing solutions that could be rapidly prototyped and deployed. In the years following the war, the U.S. military established formal mechanisms to encourage and evaluate soldier-initiated innovations, creating programs that directly trace their origins to lessons learned from the hedgerow cutter's development. One such program, established in 1958 and called the Soldier Innovation Initiative, offered financial incentives and recognition for service members who developed practical solutions to field problems. Over its first decade, the program received thousands of submissions and implemented dozens of innovations ranging from improved body armor designs to more efficient field communications equipment. None achieved the fame of the Cullen device, but collectively they represented a cultural shift toward valuing practical experience and frontline insights. Program administrators explicitly cited Cullen's example when explaining their mission. The best solutions often come from those closest to the problem. Our job is to create systems that identify these solutions and get them deployed quickly. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the Cullen story is its reminder of how many good ideas probably died unheard during the war and throughout history. For every Curtis Cullen who got his chance, how many other mechanics, drivers, cooks, and clerks had equally valuable insights that never reached anyone who could implement them? How many problems remained unsolved, not because they were inherently unsolvable, but because the person with the solution lacked access or credibility? This question haunted Cullen in his later years. In his 1984 interview with historian David Carter, he returned to this theme repeatedly. "I got lucky. That's what people don't understand. Not lucky that I had the idea. Lots of guys probably had similar ideas. Lucky that I worked for an officer willing to listen. Lucky that the test worked on the first try. Lucky that word spread before it could be buried. Luck, luck, luck. And for every lucky guy like me, there were probably 10 guys with good ideas that nobody ever heard." This awareness didn't make Cullen bitter, but it did make him an advocate. In his quiet post-war life, he became known in his community for listening to young people's ideas, no matter how impractical they seemed. Local parents would send their kids to Cullen's garage when they had inventions or projects, knowing the old mechanic would take them seriously. He'd examine their sketches and prototypes with the same careful attention he'd once applied to tank modifications. Sometimes he'd gently explain why an idea wouldn't work, using those moments as teaching opportunities about physics, materials, or practicality. Other times, he'd offer suggestions for improvement or connect young inventors with resources they needed. On a few occasions, he helped bring promising ideas to fruition, including one young woman's design for a more efficient automobile jack that eventually received a patent. When asked why he devoted so much time to these young inventors, Cullen's answer was simple. "Somebody listened to me when I needed it. I'm just paying it forward." The strategic implications of the Cullen device extended beyond World War II into subsequent conflicts and military planning. During the Vietnam War, when American forces again found themselves fighting in difficult terrain that favored defenders, military planners specifically referenced the hedgerow cutter when considering how to adapt equipment for jungle warfare. While the specific solution, steel prongs, wasn't applicable to Vietnamese jungles, the underlying principle was. Sometimes simple mechanical modifications can solve complex tactical problems more effectively than sophisticated new technologies. This thinking influenced the development of various roam plow configurations used to clear jungle vegetation, though these tools remained controversial due to their environmental impact and mixed tactical effectiveness. In more recent conflicts from Iraq to Afghanistan, the principle of rapid field modification has continued. When American troops in Iraq faced improvised explosive devices, IEDs, soldiers in the field began developing various protective modifications to vehicles, ranging from sandbags to welded armor plates to sophisticated electronic jamming equipment. While military procurement officials sometimes resisted these ad hoc solutions, preferring centrally designed and tested equipment. The most effective commanders recognize the value of soldier-initiated innovation and work to support it. In this sense, the spirit of Curtis Cullen's improvised hedgerow cutter lives on, not as a specific piece of equipment, but as a philosophy about where good ideas come from and how organizations should respond to them. The human dimension of Cullen's story, his humility, his troubled conscience about the destructive purposes of his creation, his post-war dedication to helping others, adds depth to what might otherwise be just another tale of military innovation. He wasn't a one-dimensional hero who solved a problem and lived happily ever after, basking in glory. He was a complex person who grappled with moral questions about his contribution to the war effort, who questioned whether he deserved the recognition he received, and who channeled his experiences into trying to make civilian life better for those around him. This complexity makes his story more valuable as a historical lesson. Real innovation comes from real people with doubts, fears, and imperfections. The lesson isn't be a genius like Curtis Cullen. The lesson is be willing to try solving problems despite your doubts and create environments where others feel empowered to do the same. Today, original Cullen hedgerow devices are rare artifacts. Most were removed from tanks after the war and scrapped for metal during post-war recovery efforts. A few dozen examples survive in museums and private collections, carefully preserved as reminders of how simple solutions can have profound impacts. When visitors to military museums see these crude steel prongs welded to Sherman tanks, they often seem underwhelmed. They expected something more impressive, more technologically sophisticated. That reaction itself is instructive. It reminds us that revolutionary innovations don't always look revolutionary. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs aren't about creating something complex and new, but about seeing familiar problems from a fresh angle and applying existing resources in novel ways. The Cullen device stands as a testament to several enduring truths: that necessity truly is the mother of invention, that good ideas can come from anywhere, that sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution, that organizations need to create space for unconventional thinking, and that individual initiative, when supported by enlightened leadership, can change the course of events in ways both large and small. Curtis Cullen didn't set out to become a historical figure or to teach lessons about innovation. He just wanted to stop watching his fellow soldiers die unnecessarily. The fact that his practical solution to an immediate problem ended up offering lasting insights into creativity, leadership, and the democratic potential of human ingenuity is perhaps the most fitting legacy of all, one that continues to inspire new generations of problem solvers who believe that ordinary people, armed with determination and practical knowledge, can accomplish extraordinary things when given the chance.